So I'm Lory Beth Huffman, the Appalachian District Superintendent, as well as the Director of Connectional Ministries for Western North Carolina. And I have with me as co-facilitators tonight the Dr. Reverend Alan Stanton and Reverend Ben Gatton. And let me introduce them for just a second, and then we will get started with a conversation tonight around thriving rural churches. And so I'm pleased to have Alan join us. He is an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church. He currently serves, though, outside of Western North Carolina as a senior fellow for leadership, faith, and community with the University of the Ozarks. So he is over in Memphis, right? But he has done a lot of work with the rural church. He's written several books. He has worked in Tennessee with initiatives and partnerships with rural churches in rural communities. One of his books is Reclaiming the Rural, Building Thriving Rural Congregations. He's also got another one coming out. No, it's already came out to 2024, The Gift of Small, Embracing Your Church's Vocation. And has another one coming out next year. So that's exciting. So we welcome Alan, and we're also thrilled to have Reverend Ben Gatton, who I would describe as a practitioner, as a pastor of rural churches. And Ben spent the last 10 years in Allegheny County, North Carolina. He served at Sparta United Methodist, and he has just now moved to a newly formed Cooperative Parish made up of smaller congregations in Western Allegheny and Southern Virginia. And his work over the past years has included church planting, creative approaches to evangelism, and community-focused outreach. So I'm just excited to have these as conversation partners to guide us tonight, and there will be time for you all to join the conversation as well. But I wanted to start by asking both of these guys, why do you care about the rural church, and why is the rural church important to you? Alan.
See, I was gonna let Ben go first. Um, I'm gonna say a couple of things. So one, I never really intended to be focused on rural. It was sort of an accident. But what I realized when I was in seminary and then after seminary when I was a rural pastor was that the rural church is really a place I think that if you're looking at who is going to help lead a community through a society and a culture that's really changing rapidly, and to do that in any sort of way that's like grounded in some vision of what we proclaim. It's got to be the church, right? The church is kind of the institution that holds a community together, whether or not we recognize that. Um, and then more personally, I mean, I recognize the older I get that so much of what I learned in life, and so much of what formed me to do anything good, like leadership or the way I interact with people or the way I engage with like community partners, and a lot of my work is in those areas. Like that I learned all that in the church or in something that was adjacent to the church. So like I learned leadership skills by being a high schooler in a rural church where because they needed somebody to be on a committee, they would put a 15-year-old on a committee. And then they were also, the sponsors of our Boy Scout troop. And so I was in Boy Scouts because of church. I mean, so kind of everything that I learned that was really formational growing up came out of the church. And so I think part of my passion is to help churches kind of claim those things that they're doing really, really well, so that other people can experience that and be formed by that.
Sure. Thanks. Ben, what about you? Why is the rural church important to you?
Yeah, so I grew up in rural Ohio, and I actually grew up next door to a small rural church. And my family was friends with the pastor of that church, and I spent my summers playing with his kids in there. I literally grew up inside of a rural church and has always played a really important part in my life and in my own spiritual formation. Uh, after college, I moved to Charlotte because I thought the answers were in the big city, and cities are great, don't get me wrong. But living in the city, I realized how much I missed about small rural communities and small rural churches. So I've been back in rural spaces for about 15 years now. And, similar to what Alan said, there are things that small rural churches can do that other churches can't. And Jesus identified as Jesus of Nazareth, which was a small backwater town that some people thought nothing good could come out of it. And yet we saw amazing things that Jesus did in small rural communities. And I love to see the ways that God is still at work in some of the smallest, most rural places where the Holy Spirit is moving and discipleship and evangelism is happening in unique and wonderful ways that can only happen out in the country.
I love that. Thank you. Well, why don't I open us in prayer and then I'll get us started in our conversation tonight. Let us pray. Gracious and holy God, we are grateful for the opportunity to just to press pause on all of the busyness of our lives and to focus on and spend a few minutes in thoughtful conversation around the value and the beauty and the importance of our rural churches across Western North Carolina. So, Holy Spirit, come and bless our thoughts, our reflections, our learnings, and our conversation as we continue to strengthen the ministry of our rural churches in rural communities. All of this, those gathered on this call, those that will listen at a future point in time, I just seek your blessing upon them. Amen. So as part of the Equip and Connect with rural, when we were coming up with the themes, and rural churches was one of those options, thriving rural churches, I raised my hand to be the host for this topic because it is something that I feel very strongly about as well. Especially since I have served as the Appalachian District Superintendent, and I've done 2 rounds in this beautiful part of the conference. And we have 74 churches currently in the Appalachian District, and 54 of them qualify as rural. So we are the second biggest rural church conference. And I was asking the conference office for some stats, and they looked up for me Western North Carolina as a whole. The conference as a whole has 320 churches out of 624 are rural. So that's just over 51% of our churches are rural. And when we have conversations, sometimes people talk about the big churches, the high steeple churches as our strong churches. And I constantly raise my hand to say, wait, stop. Our small churches can be incredibly strong, even though they may be small in numbers. And I've seen it time and time again where our rural churches in rural communities, and especially I would argue our United Methodist churches in these rural communities, are the centers of so many important ministry, life-giving ministry to these communities. And so I'm happy for us to have this conversation, to understand, share a few concepts, to understand about how our rural churches are strong, even though some may look at them and say, oh goodness, they maybe don't measure up in the same way. We believe differently. And so let's oh wait, I do want to say one other thing. The other thing about Western North Carolina that we are truly blessed is we do have a lot of wonderful resources that also support our rural churches. And we have to give a shout out to Duke Endowment and the incredible 100 years of that foundation supporting our rural churches in so many ways. And I am super glad to see Heather Kilburn on here. The North Carolina Rural Center also offers some amazing resourcing and programming and learning for our rural churches, and there are other resources as well. So we are blessed to be able to lean in to those opportunities and resources. But let's begin our conversation tonight. And Alan, I wonder if you would get us started by sharing the idea of the rural church as an anchor institution. We talk about anchor churches a lot these days in the United Methodist Church, but I'm not sure folks think about that in terms of a rural setting. So share with us why this is actually a very true statement.
Yeah. So first, like, let me say thanks for having me, Lory, Beth. And I want to give a shout out to Lory, Beth, who really over the last couple of years I've gotten to work with her, and like her passion for rural churches in Western North Carolina Conference is really remarkable. And the amount of resources that Western North Carolina and North Carolina has, and I would include Heather in that. Like when I moved to Tennessee, I was like, oh, there must be a North Carolina, there must be like a Tennessee Rural Center, and there's not. Um, so y'all are really lucky to have those resources and have the support from the annual conference. So when we think about anchor institutions, that's one of those like kind of made up sociological words that we have. And so there's all these academic definitions, and I'm just going to use this one, right? So we talk about anchor institutions as community organizations that contribute to the social fabric and the economic development of a community, right? So typically when we think about them, we think of them as like large things. So we think about like hospitals or universities or corporations or philanthropies. And the reality is that most rural places don't have these, right? But we do have lots of rural churches. So there are a couple of like hallmarks of an anchor institution as we're defining it. So they're permanent and long-standing. And I would venture to say that, most of your churches are at least 75 years old, 100 years old, 150 years old, right? I pastored a church in rural North Carolina that was brought into the connection by Francis Asbury, right? So there are people in your community who don't remember not having your church. Like they don't know a world in which your church has not existed. Um, you might be in that camp of like someone who doesn't remember a world in which your church doesn't exist. So when we talk about permanent institutions, like you in the rural church, like the rural church is really it. They are places of community resilience and strength, and you can particularly see that, I think, in times of disaster. So when you look at the places where your communities have built resilience following a hurricane, for instance, um, those are places where the community kind of gathers and finds what it means to be in a community again. Anchor institutions have an economic impact, and I get a lot of like weird looks when we talk about this one, but there was actually a study done about Western North Carolina in particular a few years ago, and it was more than $735,000 a year on average that a single rural church contributed to their community. And you think about like all the people that go to lunch after your church, right? Like that has an economic impact. Um, you guys do, I mean, if you start counting up the number of meals you serve and the number of people who are impacted by that, like, there's a value to that, and it adds up. And then the last one is there are places that build culture. And as I was sharing kind of in my little preamble earlier, like I think rural churches are one of the few places left that can build culture. We're really forming people to talk about the world and see the world in a particular way, and that is through Jesus Christ. So um, I think about rural churches as kind of like they have all these hallmarks, right? And so then it becomes a question of, well, how do we actually do the work of being an anchor institution? And I found this graphic. I'm going to throw it up on the PowerPoint here, if everybody can see that. So I stole this from the Sycamore Institute in Nashville. They talk about like a flourishing ecosystem and a flourishing community as a tree with like roots that grow deep. And they talk about these sort of like four things. So financial security and prosperity, satisfaction, fulfillment, and strong character, family, friends, and community, and physical and mental health. And when you think about anchor institutions building flourishing communities, right? And this is what anchor institutions do. I can see the rural church in all of these. And in fact, the rural church is often the only place in the community that is doing all of these. And you can start with, the really simple ones like family, friends, and community. And as I shared, my entire social life growing up was really rooted in the church. Like my friends were in youth group, I was in scouts, my family was in the church. So like when I needed an access point into the community, when I needed to know something about my community, it was through the local church. The local church was connecting me. And I think that's particularly true in rural places. And I live in Memphis now, but I often like to joke that like my entire social world is still within the local church. It's through the people I meet on Sunday or the people I hang out with at Scouts, which is also housed in my church, right? Um, and you don't have to, it's not just like the people you connect with, but like think about all the people that are represented in a congregation. So if your church has recent small business owners who have, sold their small business and retired, or farmers or teachers and retired nurses, elected officials or lawyers, you are probably one of the few places that has that representation of the community, of that many different sectors, kind of sitting in a pew every Sunday talking to each other. No one else has that. And so you get to have this like nice swath of the community where you can actually sort of understand what's happening in the entire community just by going to church, right? We talk about satisfaction, fulfillment, and character building. I mean, I think building character, there's something about the church that we're supposed to do some sort of moral formation last time I checked. So that's an important component. But also, we know that, and this is a Harvard study, people who go to church, who are committed and like in a church, they have a higher satisfaction of life. Um, in rural places, churches are still trusted institutions in a way that they're not, and you're one of the few trusted institutions. So when people need advice, they're going to go to someone in their church. When they need a ride to the hospital, they're going to go to someone in your church, right? So you, just by being a church, are kind of contributing to this satisfaction in the community and the fulfillment of the community. We talk about physical and mental health, right? So that gets back to like people being satisfied. People who go to church have a higher, better mental health. Typically, they know where to find resources. Um, you can also think about like the small ways that your church is contributing. So if people need a ride to the doctor's office, they're often getting it from someone in your church, right? And that goes back to the connection. A lot of our rural churches are kind of the only places with AA or NA groups. Um, I think about like Hayesville United Methodist Church in Clay County. They have this excellent AA program, and they're really the only place like in that corner of the world people are going to have to drive 45 minutes or an hour to find another service like that and to find another community like that. And the last one is this financial security and prosperity. Um, in our churches, I don't think we often really account for how much we do support the financial security and well-being of the people in our communities. And so, sometimes our church is really, they're not doing formal programs necessarily, but they really are acting as a social safety net. And I remember there was this moment where when I was a pastor, a lovely lady named Frances who grew up in the church and she was approaching 80. She walks into church one Sunday morning and she said, I met this lady who is about to lose their apartment and they need $1,500 this week so they can not be homeless. And we're going to collect the $1,500 for them, right? And we didn't leave the church until Frances had $1,500 that she had collected that we were going to give, right? And so they're not these like huge programs, but by and large, when people need something, they're going to come to the church first, and they're going to come to our rural churches because that's where they are. We're starting a new school year, right? How many of your churches are collecting school supplies for kids that would not have school supplies if they didn't go to your church? How many of you did summer feeding ministries, where you were giving out food to kids who would not have something to eat if they hadn't come to your church? So when we think about the places that can actually do this flourishing community, I really think the rural church is not just a place that can do it, it's really the only place in our rural communities that can do it. And I will stop talking because you asked one question and I gave a long answer.
Thank you. I love that. And so a prompt for those of you that are on the call, and I put kind of those two subcategories in the chat is to be thinking how, because I'm just assuming that you if you're on this call, that you're part of a rural church. I'm assuming that. And I would encourage you to be thinking, in what ways can you name how your church is fulfilling either those ways of being a flourishing community, or the kind of characteristics of that strong rural church. Okay, Ben, as we were planning for this conversation, we ended up just having this great conversation around the rural church and innovation. You've used the phrase rural innovation before, and those are not two words that often go together. And the phrase captured several of us, our imagination. And I wondered if you would share a little bit more about this idea of rural innovation, and maybe even specifically, like, what does evangelism look like in the rural setting?
Thanks, Lory, Beth, and thanks for having me on this call. It's an honor to be here. And yeah, I started talking about rural innovation a few years ago because it just seemed like the most obvious thing to me, and have been surprised at people's reaction to those two words being put together. I think it comes from sometimes in rural communities and in rural churches, the way we talk about ourselves and talk about our communities, we often use the language of scarcity. We often describe ourselves by what we don't have or what we're lacking, or how we compare to some imaginary ideal that we think a church should be. And innovation is a word of abundance, because when you think with innovation, you're thinking about all of the things, all of the wealth of knowledge and wisdom and skills, and all of the things churches bring to the table, like Alan talked about, that are just abundantly on the trees as low-hanging fruit in our communities. And there's so many ways to harness those, to do exciting ministry and to connect with our community, and to share God's good news. So I thought of three things I'd like to talk about tonight when it comes to rural innovation, and ways that we can do new things in churches that maybe have been there so long nobody can imagine a world where they're not there. And I want to say that part of this comes from a dynamic that I've picked up in rural communities, which is no one can really afford to be a specialist. Everybody's a generalist. Most folks I know a little bit of plumbing, a little bit of agriculture, a little bit of carpentry, a little bit of this, and a little bit of that. And so what we end up with is with all these people that are making connections in skill sets that typically don't happen. And so the key is connecting with folks that are already engaging and thinking creatively about our rural communities. So that's why I think the first aspect of rural innovation that's important to consider is partnerships. Um, uh, Rural folks, we're fiercely independent. We love to do things on our own. We don't want to accept help from anyone if we don't need to. And when we get stuck in those lanes, we miss out on all of the good things that potential partnering organizations have, who are more than eager to come alongside the rural church. One of the main ones I always think about is the health department. In my previous appointment, we kind of felt like we were taking a gamble and reaching out to the health department. Did they even care about what's going on in the church? And what we found was immense excitement about partnering with churches. We found they had already done all of the work to listen to the communities, to assess what the needs were. They were ready to go. They just needed networks of folks that were willing and able to help. And it was through the health department that we were able to connect with local farmers, find creative new ways to get food to folks. Those kind of partnerships are critical in this new world that we're finding ourselves in. So I just have yet to think of an organization that or a group of people that can't benefit the church in a rural space. Of course, there's the big things like schools, like your local police and law enforcement and volunteer fire departments. But you can also make great connections with folks like local barbers in your area who would love to be able to use the skill sets and networks that they have, because they have great networks to reach out to people and to bless them. Another way that rural innovation can be a significant help to your church is in sustainability. One of the things that we do often here in all of our churches is concern about how uh, we're going to keep paying the bills and how moving forward, looking at the age of our congregations, how are we going to keep doing the things that we're doing? And so, you can choose to white knuckle your pews and never change anything, or you can look differently at the buildings that you have and the other assets that you have to be able to bring some sustainability to your congregation. And, uh, the beautiful thing about rural churches is they almost always have completely paid for large spaces that are or can be the centers of their community. Um, where I live, churches are just about the biggest buildings that there are that aren't barns. So when folks want to have a meeting, when people need office space, when people want to have a family reunion, we are often sitting on these buildings that are incredibly underutilized 6 days a week, maybe even 6.5 days a week. And there is tremendous opportunity for how we can open our buildings up to our communities and, uh, you know, using reasonable pricing structures, uh, be able to benefit the church that we're a part of as well. Um, Also, don't forget about your kitchens and your outdoor pavilions. Those are highly sought after things that people would love to utilize. Uh, and Outdoor space for gardens. Speaking of knowledge that people have and creative ministry, a lot of folks that I'm talking to in their 30s and 40s are really wanting to get back into food preservation and gardening and doing all of these things that were really important in the past that we kind of lost touch with. And our rural churches are full of people who know so much about those things. And our rural churches are great spaces to create opportunities to share that wealth of knowledge with our communities. And that can be both a way to conduct outreach in our communities and form the relationships that are essential to evangelism. And that's the third one I wanted to talk about was evangelism and the way that missional outreach is a part of that. I always think about Jesus says in Matthew 28, he says, in the Great Commission, go out into the world and make disciples, not converts, but disciples. And discipleship is, by definition, about relationship. And rural churches are so great at relational networks. And in my previous appointment, we found that the number one way to invite folks into the life of the church, invite folks into a life of faith, was simply to invite them into some of the things that we were already doing and participate alongside us. Um, that can feel a little counterintuitive. It can feel a little risky sometimes to invite folks that are not a part of our church and maybe don't spend a lot of time in churches to come alongside of us when we serve. Um, but don't miss out on the power of cooking a meal alongside someone that you're serving to the community and inviting folks to come alongside of you. Um, can seem pretty new and innovative to people because sometimes they're not used to churches being that warm and inviting about kind of the behind the scenes stuff that we do. Um, some other great ways that we have found to uh, establish those relationships and reach out to the community or to do things like storytelling nights, which is another great way to invite folks to come alongside of you to share stories about your community, stories about the past. And those kind of conversations, those type of friendships and relationships really can grow in to really powerful relationships and even spiritually forming connections that end up being an on-ramp into the life of your church. I wanted to talk to you along those lines about the entrepreneurs in your community. Entrepreneurs in rural communities, they're not going to look like tech startups. They're going to look like folks selling crafts on the side of the road. It's going to look like restaurant owners. It's going to look like farmers. It's going to look like people that are milling about your local agricultural farmers markets. Those are folks that are already thinking creatively and innovatively about their community, just like you are. And they are excited for invitations to come alongside rural churches and be a part of the work that we're doing. So that's how we've seen lots of folks who maybe wouldn't identify themselves as people who attend church or wouldn't even identify themselves as religious, finding themselves spending a couple of days a week in a rural church, hanging out with church folks. And that is the fertile ground that evangelism and those relationships really takes root in. And you can't fake those things. It's all about genuinely caring about the people in your community and inviting them to live life alongside of you in innovative and creative ways.
I love that. And Ben, part of the importance of thinking in terms of entrepreneur and rural community is that is a place, or that's innovation energy that can be captured or tapped or utilized. And I bet if we invited you to make a list of 2 or 3 people that you would consider entrepreneurs, you would be able to come up with those folks even in a very rural setting. And so that might be a helpful practice for you to do, is think about who are the entrepreneurs. And as Ben said, they may show up in surprising places. Alan, do you want to speak to your response to Tempest's question, which is a very good question and probably something we should have started with, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So when you start describing rural churches, you get into a lot of trouble because there's this joke in the academic world, like if you really need a paper to write, you just write about like what is the definition of rural. So within the federal government, for instance, there are like 15 different definitions of federal of like what defines rural. There's one for metropolitan, but there's 15 for rural. 11 of those are all within the USDA. So it's really hard to like put a point on like what is rural. So then it's really hard to put a point on like what is a rural church, right? So the normal church size, I mean, is not that big, right? You by the time you get to 300, average worship attendance of 300, you've passed 90% of the churches in the U.S. So I think of rural churches as being kind of normative sizes, which is usually between 30 and 60, but certainly less than 120. Though there are some that have more than that, right? There are some rural churches with like 200 people, 250 people. But rural communities are really quite different. So you have rural communities that, Clay County is in Hayesville is a rural community. So is I think Colewiesville counts as a rural community. For a while, Boone was considered a rural community, and it's just kind of like in this transition point. So it's really more about like you can measure it through population density and say like it's a little bit more, fewer people. You can measure it through how far away it is from a major metropolitan area. I kind of like that to think about like, is it still accessible to Charlotte? What does that look like? So there's lots of different ways, but I think I'm going to stop talking here in a minute because I've confused everybody, but more than helped. But one thing I like to remember is if you've seen one rural community, you've seen one rural community. And if you've seen one rural church, you've seen exactly one rural church, right? And they're so diverse and myriad and have so many unique gifts that that's what makes it so hard to pin on a definition. And also that's what's so beautiful about these rural churches.
For sure. Thank you. And Duke Endowment has its own kind of formula for how they define which churches qualify as rural and don't. And it has all to do about the community statistics
Yeah.
and how far you are from hospitals and other there's a whole matrix for identifying a church and a community as rural.
So they use the rural urban commuting area codes, which measures like how people are commuting to other places. So if you have a bedroom community, you would not necessarily be considered rural. But if you are kind of a self-supported community and most people are not commuting out, you would be considered rural. So there's like a code that the USDA puts out that had on a scale of 1 to 10, they use 4 and above as their threshold, which is the same as like what the USDA uses for, and the Health Services Administration uses that as well. So those are both really great metrics. I use that as well in my work.
Yeah. And I would direct you to the notes for characteristics of a rural church, because I think Alan kind of talked about that in his first chat with us. So we thought it might be interesting to have a conversation. Well, actually, nope, I'm going to go ahead and put this out. But if you have other questions for Alan and Ben based on what they shared, feel free to either put those into the chat, or we're going to open it up for a little bit of conversation. But I would like to hear from you all. If we're talking about vital rural churches, thriving rural churches, what does that look like? And we've had conversation around metrics that might be used to measure the health and vitality of some churches might not work or make sense in a rural church. And I would even say, I mean, Alan shared numbers, but we've got strong and vital rural churches that average 15 people in worship on a Sunday, and yet they're vital. They are impacting their community. They're making a difference. They are fulfilling all of the components of being a community of faith in a community. And so I would say right out of the gate that the average worship attendance is not necessarily indicative of a thriving rural congregation. Um, so we've got some thoughts on this, but I would love to hear what y'all's thoughts are on what do you think are characteristics of or metrics of a church that you would say is thriving. What do you see? What do you experience? Like, just how would you describe a thriving church, rural church? You can either write something in the chat, or you can unmute. And Ben, I saw you unmute, so please share what you were going to share.
Yeah, I was thinking about metrics. That's something I think about a lot when it comes to measuring whether a rural church is thriving or is vital or not, because it can be discouraging. We all know that in Methodist world, we've got reports to fill out, and sometimes those numbers that you write down can look really small on the screen, but we know there's actually some really powerful stories behind those numbers. Sometimes when you're doing your reports in January, sometimes putting 5 in the Sunday school class is like a 50% increase. And that's kind of a big deal. So what we've learned to do is to measure our success in stories. And it's a both and situation. The numbers are important, but we make sure to write down, to catalog, to share, and celebrate the stories that go alongside and behind those numbers. And those are sometimes stories of transformation and discipleship, because in a small rural community, if you've got a story of how one person's life was utterly transformed by your church community, that is a sign of vitality. And that's something that needs to be written down, talked about, and shared. And sometimes it's really important to track the ways you tried. There have been so many things over the last 10 years that I have done that just did not work. One of the most expensive ones I ever did was we got a team of people that just thought it was going to be the biggest breakthrough to provide a drive-through breakfast on the way to school for parents and kids, that they were going to love it, that you don't have to make breakfast at home, just drive through. We'll serve you a hot, delicious breakfast you can eat in the car on the way to school. I think like maybe 6 people came in a total of 4 weeks. It just didn't work. And even when I'm talking about it, I'm like, I still think this is a good idea.
No, I would like that, please.
But we tried, and that trial led to iterations of the idea that ended up leading to other things. So, boy, I get really nervous when a church hasn't tried anything. But a church that can show ideas that they've tried, even if they haven't worked, I think that's a beautiful indicator of vitality.
I love that. I love that. All right, folks, what would you add to this list? I know you have thoughts on this because some of you, your pastors, ask you for the information that go into that statistical report that people like me read. And so what would you say is a sign that a church is in fact thriving and vital?
I think having children present and doing activities for the children shows a sign of vitality.
And thank you, Sharnetta. And that absolutely can be a sign of vitality, and it can bring energy into a church. And yet I think it's context matters, because I've had conversations with some of the churches in my district up in the mountains are places where retirees are the people who are coming into the community, and they don't have children. Their children have grown up. They might have grandkids, but a church can be vital that is bringing in new members that are in their 60s and 70s, 50s, maybe even retired, and in a new community with giftedness and skills, but they don't really know anyone. And so context matters. There are places where connecting in, where if there are families with children around you, then absolutely, those are important relationships to make. But you might also, not you, churches might also realize that some of their best new or next members are older folks or middle-aged folks that are all around their community but not plugged in. But thank you. I love that. And that comment just reminded me of a conversation that we had. Yeah, Alan?
Yeah, I'll add to that. Like, I love kids and youth and young adults in church, and like there are so many great churches where like that is absolutely what their vitality demands. I would also say like don't get discouraged if you don't have kids, and because if you're a community where like your fastest growing population is in migration from recent retirees, there are a lot of great things that recent retirees bring to the table. So higher disposable income, typically, more hours to volunteer. So I have two small kids, right? And I don't have a ton of extra hours. And also I have two small kids in student loans, so I don't really have like a ton of extra money. Um, but and I'm like your ideal target demographic for a lot of churches. I'm in my 30s with a family, and you would be really better served by having my parents show up because they are going to spend more time volunteering, and they're going to spend more time, like more money on your church. And also they have like a lot of career experience that they can share. So there's a lot of gifts that we don't want to overlook either with youth and young adults. And if you have youth and young adults, then I think you're in a really great position to nurture their vocations and like bring about some intergenerational ministry that's not really possible in other larger churches sometimes. So, yeah.
Thanks, Alan. One of the things, though, I love, Sharnetta, about churches that are rural churches that are able to engage families with children is you do begin to see some beautiful intergenerational work. Because a lot of times rural churches, they don't have enough children for a youth group, right? but wow, they may not, like their grandparents might live 2 states away, and that church environment can provide 4 or 5 grandmas or granddads. And and I've seen big churches try and create that, and they fail miserably. And rural churches and small churches just do it naturally. That is a strength. These are great comments. A welcoming church. Absolutely. Your hospitality in the rural church is so, so important. A willingness to innovate, very much aligned with what Ben was saying, that a thriving rural church is willing to try some new things. And aligned in the direction of the church, right? That having a vision and a mission, a purpose, and being aligned around that. Absolutely. Love it. Mary says reaching out into the community, and especially through schools. That is one of those important partners that Ben was talking about. And nursing homes, you're right. That's another vulnerable population that might not have, especially if, it's the flip side. You might have nursing homes where children live 2 or 3 states away. So how can the church care for folks that family might be further than they would want them to be? Kathy has offered some suggestions. Engaging in the community with lunch and learns. I love that. SGA. What is SGA? Oh, Kathy, you're unmuted.
It stands for sharing God's abundance.
Oh, I love that. So it's like a community meal that you do. I'm telling you, United Methodist churches in rural communities are one of the primary feeders. You all provide either food pantries or community meals or takeaway meals. Like it is amazing the footprint that our churches have in caring for rural communities. Tom says the freedom to dream big. And again, that's out of abundance, right? When we have a scarcity mentality, we sometimes get caught up in, well, we're just going to keep doing things the way we've always done them. And small churches can dream big. Absolutely. And Penny says intentionally dedicated to growing more like Jesus. So I love that. That's the discipleship component. And also can be powerful witness in rural churches where folks are literally living their faith out in such tangible ways that folks looking on from the outside in can't help but see the example and the love of Jesus being lived out. Yeah, Alan.
I was just thinking, I mean, I think that theological identity is like core to what it means to be a vital church. I mean, you go back to thinking about like Aristotle used to talk about what it meant to be a good racehorse, right? It meant you were fast. And to be a good Christian meant that you were a follower of Jesus, right? Like that's what we do. And I remember one of my favorite churches that I've ever been to, they told me they're like, we're a praying church. Like we pray and we'll teach you how to pray. And so when it came time for like the pastoral prayer, the lay leader stood up and literally there's like 20 people in the sanctuary and he starts and he's like, all right, Lory, Beth, what are we praying for you about this week? And they go around and everyone is expected to like name, I mean, something, right? Like it could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing, a praise, a celebration, whatever it is. But everyone is going to pray. And what I remember about that was like, one, it was incredibly awkward. And it's not like seeker friendly, right? Because all of a sudden you're being vulnerable, but you're also learning like if you're going to be part of this church, you're going to learn how to pray. And like, isn't that a great church? I mean, they're teaching you how to pray. Like that's at the core of what we're supposed to be doing. And I just thought like this is a really vital church with 20 people because they're doing this very simple thing, this simple action that like we should all be practicing.
Mm-hmm. And my hunch is if someone was new and they were stumbling through it, that people came alongside them and helped them out. Like they did their best to help make it feel not awkward.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I love it. I'm gonna go ahead and put this in the chat, and I'm gonna, oh, hold on. Perfect. But I'm also going to share one of the things that in talking with Rob Webb, and oh my gosh, you know, a wealth of knowledge and experience with the rural church, and we were having a conversation, and so he offered up these 7 things that their work over like 20 years with rural churches, they have found consistently are characteristics of thriving rural churches. One of them is a focus on formation. We were just talking about that at the heart of what they do, it's not being a business, but it is forming people to be Jesus followers. The second characteristic is seeing church and congregational assets. So they're able to recognize, and we've actually talked about this early on, that in rural churches, the wealth of skills and abilities are amazing. So it is not just dollars in a bank account, but the assets of, you know, it might be the church building, it may be some aspect of the property, but it's also the ministry and the skills of the people that make up the church. Developing a learning culture. So thriving rural churches, this is kind of the willing to try something new or dream big. It's churches that are willing to learn and learn what they don't know, and reach out to resources available to them. Fostering leadership. A lot of times our rural churches have rural community leaders in them, and also by nature of being small and everybody's kind of has to have a job or a role, it fosters leadership among the whole of the church family. Embracing hospitality, caring for folks, well, welcoming folks. It in a thriving rural church, that comes naturally and free flowing. A family church where if you're not part of the family, you're not welcome, that's not necessarily a thriving church, and you can feel the difference as a guest in a heartbeat. The 6th one, creating new networks. So it's constantly figuring out who are new partnerships, just like the health department being a new partner that maybe you've not thought about reaching out to, but always looking for ways to create new networks. And then the last one, communicating both internally and externally. So a thriving rural church knows how to communicate and share with those that make up the church family, but they also know how to communicate beyond the church walls. So I wonder, before we wrap up, are there anything else anybody wants to add to our list of characteristics of a thriving rural church? Or are there any last questions that you want to ask that's on your mind right now?
Hi, Lory, Beth. I just wanted to share a resource for everyone. I'm Heather Kilborn. I work at the North Carolina Rural Center, and we're funded by the Duke Endowment to do in-person coaching with your rural community, to do what I say, that the Calvary is coming and it is you. So we help you see that God has already gifted you with everything you need for a community ministry. And we're taking applications for that now, and I'll put the link in the chat. So if you're thinking about it, just reach out to us and talk to us, and we can tell you more about the program. But the idea is, to see the gifts that are already in your church and how it can be used for your community.
Thank you, Heather. I love that. And yeah, absolutely get the link, pull that link off of the chat, folks, if you're interested or want to learn more. Another program that the rural church does, the rural center does for rural churches, is the Connect program. If your church ever has the opportunity to participate in that, It's an amazing visioning process, dreaming process, and they teach you how to do that in a way that leads to a concrete idea with some funding support to help make that idea come to be. So it's just an excellent program that several of the churches in my district have done. And I can name some of their projects afterwards that have made a huge difference. So
I'm gonna just piggyback on something Heather said because I was gonna quote her and I'm still gonna quote her. Um, Heather is one of like the smartest people who does rural church development right now. I mean, she's just fantastic. So if you haven't talked to her, please go talk to her. But she said something about the Calvary is coming and it's you. And I think that's so important when we are talking about what it means to be a thriving rural congregation. That is something that I don't think that like the annual conference or general conference can like tell you exactly. That is something that I really think each church has to kind of come up with and understand like this is what it means for my congregation and my particular community to be vital. And then you have to be able to tell that story to everyone else. Because we're at a really pivot point, both in our annual conference and in the United Methodist Church and in our society, right? Where we're trying to understand like how to navigate these changes together. And so your ability to tell that story, that's part of you being the Calvary. And we really need you to be able to do that and take up that work. And so thank you for doing that.
I love that. And you know what? Alan's right, y'all. That's why I can stand before you and say a church of 15 can be vital because they've told me their story. I've seen their story and I can tell their story in a way that shows that they are a vital congregation. But our rural churches need to find your voices and be able to tell the story. And last thing, or maybe last thing, maybe next to last thing, Tempest has made such an interesting point in the chat about a church where it used to be in a rural setting and it's grown up around them and it's no longer a rural setting by definition, but the church culturally is still rural. I actually lived that out when I was appointed. You might not believe this, but when I was appointed to Sharon United Methodist in Charlotte, that's the church it's now South Park, but it was right across from South Park Mall. And back in the day, the paved road ended right there for Charlotte, and it was rural. And when I was there, they still had original members because that church was started in like the early 50s. And it absolutely had a rural culture to it. I recognized it immediately. It was actually a lot like First Taylorsville that I served. It was a small town, kind of rural church. And recognizing that was critical in being able to figure out the culture and the culture of the church within the culture of the community. And we had to do a lot of work to find that niche. So you're wise to recognize that. And my advice on that is that culture doesn't change instantaneously, but there is value in doing work of figuring out where are the commonalities between the culture within the church and the culture of the community surrounding it, and finding those places of commonality to lean into is important. But this is a conversation churches have to have a lot, like churches that have been in transition culturally, where historically maybe it was a white church and the neighborhood transitioned, and that church had to figure out, all right, how do we be a multicultural church now? And some churches handled that well, and some
Yes.
not. So it's important, but challenging work, and I hear you on that. Any other questions as we are at the 8 o'clock hour? But I want to make sure if there was something that you wanted to say or ask, you had the chance to do so before we wrap it up. Well, thanks so much for your time and for being part of the conversation. We do hope this has been helpful and helped you think about your rural setting, maybe in some different ways. It wasn't an information dump, but more of a conversation with some new concepts. And happy to feel free to reach out to any one of us if you've got other questions, and we'll make sure we respond. But otherwise, thank you, everybody. Have a great evening.
Do you need us to hang around at all? Like, do you need to debrief anything?
Yeah, sorry, I think some folks left.
And you're
no,
still recording, by the way.